Let's design the Galactic Line. I've written some essays about a variety of the pieces of the Galactic Line, like the missions and stuff like that, but I haven't talked about the resource system, the shipboard resource system. It's changing, so I figured I would talk about it and I would describe my thought process and how I plan for it to work. Right now, what we've got is a very, very precise resource system. It's good for something like Kerbal, where you're tracking every possible element for every second it can exist. But here you can see we've got an hour of energy, 170 days of hydrogen, 4 days of water, and that's not really suitable for our kind of gameplay because we're not making Kerbal. We don't want to have that hard limit where suddenly you run out of supplies and die, because that's not very interesting. Our game is more like Star Trek or The Sims, so we need to have something where resources don't just run out. And I also wanted to simplify it so that building ships was less of a chore. So let's talk about it. What I'd like to do is make it so that when you put a resource system in the ship, it's a lot easier for you to understand exactly what it can do. So here's our reactor, right? And right now our reactor is something like produces 1,000 megawatts of power. And then it's like, oh, each of our ion engines requires 100 megawatts, and each of our sensor dishes requires 50 megawatts, and so on and so forth. And you just do some math. Figure out if you need more reactors or batteries or something. What I'd like to do is remove that complexity and say that this just provides enough. No matter what kind of ion engines you add in, or whether or not you add in sensor dishes or HAB units or whatever, I just want it to always be considered enough. You don't have to worry about exactly how much power is where. Similarly, all of these crew compartments here, you need to have some food for them, but you add in a supply box and it's enough. It provides enough food for them. Well, that's also not going to be enough because we need a little bit more meat there. What I'd like to do is I'd like to make it so that this generates stories automatically or can be integrated into automatically generated stories. For example, you have enough power. Well, what happens when you have to take your reactor offline and repair it? What happens when there's a space station whose reactor died and you have to charge them? You have to give them your power so that they can live. There are situations where you might not have the same power requirements. What happens if you need to overload your reflector dish to positronic the space wedgie? What happens if you have to use your supplies for something else? What if you're stuck in space for extraordinarily long periods of time? What if you need to give your supplies to a colony world that is suffering? There are lots of situations where your resource consumption is different than what would normally be the case. This can automatically build some interesting situations. So if you're in your ship wandering around as a person and you have to take your reactor offline, then what you'll see is an event where your ship is dark and all of the crew are worried. And you've got like a certain number of hours of time where there is no life support, no lights, nothing. And if you give away your food to that starving colony, you'll have this situation where your crew are starving and they're hungry and they're desperate. And those make for interesting situations. I can automatically weave the characters together, the crew together, in their shared concerns about the state of your ship. And it will naturally feel very natural. It will be like, yeah, of course everybody's worried about the fact that they're starving. They're starving. And of course I have to give you an outlet for that, like someplace you can land that's sketchy but might have food and stuff like that. It would be a fun way to introduce very, very easy missions into the world. You ran out of food. Here's a mission where you can land on a planet over there. It's introduced by you walking around on the dark ship and people saying, okay, well, we desperately need to get over there to that planet because that planet has food, and someone else will say that planet's actually a haven to the giant monsters of Grathalgamor, and they'll eat us or whatever, and it unfolds. It'll be fun. But I want it to be more flexible than that, because I want your designs to feel like they have a purpose. Simply slinking, slamming in one of each kind of supply is going to make for very, very boring ships. So what I was thinking is the concept of a margin. So you put another reactor in, or maybe not a reactor, maybe batteries, whatever you happen to prefer, right? And the concept here is that it goes from being enough to being margin 1 or 2 or 3 or however many extra systems you add in. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that even if your main reactor were to go down, you could work off of your marginal power. You could work off of your battery power. And it's the same basic concept. You'd be walking around the ship and the lights would be half off, or they'd be red or whatever. And people would be saying things like, "Oh, we're running on battery power, Captain." And that would be great. You'd still have a fair amount of functionality. There'd probably be some penalty, some speed penalty to using your various objects. Your ion engines wouldn't fire as hard, or your proton cannons would take longer to charge or something. But the basic idea would be you'd still be functional. And if you needed to go and give your power to the space station, well, you'd still be functional. You'd be on marginal power. But you'd also have this opportunity, the story would have this opportunity to insert more plot elements. So you're tethered to the space station. You can't leave the space station because you are giving them your power. Well, there is something going on down there on the planet. There's something on the planet that you have to deal with. You can't go down in your ship because you're tethered to the space station. Well, there is an excuse to send down a shuttlecraft with just a couple of your crew, and they'll land on the planet instead of your whole ship. And then, of course, they can't expect a lot of support. Your comms are at half power. You can't use any orbital weapons or anything. You can't leave the space station. You might go around the dark side of the planet and not be able to talk to them. There are so many cool details that we can wedge in using a fairly simple adaptive mission system where we can just throw together pieces of missions as your resources allow. See? So you'd never see this part if you didn't have marginal power. If you didn't have marginal power, then just being tethered to the space station would be devastating enough that would be in itself a critical event. But if you do have marginal power, then you get more stuff to make your experience more complicated. That's my thought on how to make ship construction more interesting and easier. You can really, really see how you might be able to figure out cool ship designs that feel flexible and go on cool missions. One of the things that I haven't really talked about, though, is what happens when you use the wrong category of ship device. So, for example, if I wanted to include giant Macross beam cannons into my small ship here, I might go ahead and just open up a larger scale ship design set and plonk those objects in. There's nothing preventing me from doing that. If I were to just go down here and hit play, I can show you that. We can go in and grab some small ship stuff. Here is a small ship fuel cell, just doop. And here's a small ship cockpit. And then what we'll do is we'll just go into here and we'll say, okay, well, yeah, let's go ahead and put in a large-scale rocket engine and a large-scale fuel tank system. And you can see that things are radically the wrong size. How are you going to deal with that? Well, I was thinking that we could use margin here as well, but in an unusual way. Basically, my thought on the matter is that obviously it's not a problem if you are including a resource source that is the same scale. So I mean, if you're attaching a big-ass generator, then sure, you can use big-ass guns. But assuming that we're stuck with this little generator, how do we use these big-ass guns? They're the wrong class. They're a size up. Well, what we can do is we can have an adapter, and I think it would be very easy to include these adapters in whatever sort of category we needed them to be. And basically, the adapter can take your power offline and charge a scale up. So over the next hour or whatever, you have to have your main power offline, and you can either operate on margin or you can just be dark, and it will create enough power to use one of the devices that's a scale up, or one set of devices from a scale up. And that will introduce a delay, it will introduce a cost, and it seems to work well. I think that that is probably the best way to do things. In terms of going the other direction, like just equipping smaller stuff on your ship, I might make it so that smaller stuff works at 100% when you're on marginal power. That seems like it would be fine. So if you included a giant reactor here or giant batteries here, then they would have a margin that was the scale up from the size of the rest of your crew quarters, right? So if your power went offline, you would just use these giant margins and your crew quarters would be fine. Your crew would be like, we're on marginal power, but it's like marginal power for a space station, so who cares? We'll just keep living on here just as we are. Those are my thoughts on what I'm going to turn our shipboard resources into. And this is going to make it a lot easier for people to design ships, for people to understand how their ship works, for people to understand the state of their ship. More importantly, it's going to provide us with a lot of really, really nice hooks for our generative gameplay. Let me know what you think, and that's the sort of thing I think about when I am trying to design a game.